Today's program, entitled Public Employee Post-Employment Costs, a Slow Motion Disaster. This will be interesting too, and it's no surprise that we have so many public officials here in the audience today. I'm sure the questions will be interesting. We've all heard for years that CalPERS, the state public employee pension plan, has failed to meet its investment goals, creating an environment where we have an ever-growing funding shortfall. The result is that now CalPERS is taking steps to increase required contributions from participating governmental agencies, and pension costs to cities are expected to double as a percentage of city general fund budgets by 2024. Many are worried that these cost increases will threaten the ability of Marin cities to provide basic services in light of these funding requirements. We're therefore pleased to present Larry Chu, Larkspur City Council, and John McCauley from the Mill Valley City Council, who will be talking about this topic. They've authored a paper called Marin County Local Government Reform of Pensions and Other Post-Employment Benefits, Revisiting the Problem and Scope of Solutions. And their presentation today will be based in large part on that paper. The authors suggest that there are no easy answers here, but there are some steps that cities can take to prepare for the challenges that are faced ahead. John McCauley was elected to the Mill Valley City Council in 2013. He currently serves as a council member. He served as mayor from 2015 to 2016. Previously, he spent 6 years on the city's planning commission. He served as chair in 2010 and 2013 of that commission. He's a retired CPA and a retired partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers. I always figured they can't decide what they want to call themselves, right? So they just put all the names in there. PricewaterhouseCoopers, serving financial services clients throughout his entire career. He teaches a course on financial services at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. Larry Chu has served in the Larkspur City Council since 2003. He's served multiple terms as both mayor and vice mayor. He served as president of the Marin County Council of Mayors and Council Members, where he organized and chaired the Committee on Pension Reform and Post-Employment Benefits. He has authored 2 reports on the topic. He's been with financial services firms since 1979 in a wide variety of operational roles, including accounting, finance, this is a long list, accounting, finance, tax, information security, business continuity, venture capital, due diligence, pension administration, and reporting. Is there anything else that you could possibly do that you didn't do? Very nice. He's very widespread. Very good. All right, there's your introduction. I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker who will introduce his presentation, Mr. Chu.
Thank you, Scott. Well, thank you for attending. For those of you who have been around longer than about 8 years, there's a presentation that I made back in 2011 as well. One of the things that Scott didn't mention was that, can't hear me back there. One of the things that Scott didn't mention was that tonight will effectively be my second to the last meeting as a Larkspur council member, so I am retiring from at least public office. It doesn't mean that I won't still remain involved in other public policy issues, and this will be one of them that I will continue to spend a lot of my personal time on. So much of tonight's or this afternoon's presentation will be made by John McCauley. He was the co-author on this second paper that was commissioned through the MCCMC's Marin County Mayor Council Marin County Council of Mayors and Council Members. So the MCCMC, executive board commissioned this on our bequest to study this problem again. We felt that it was needed as a second follow-up since the first one that was done in 2011, and even with some of the members in our audience tonight, Kevin Haroff and Bruce Ackerman from Larkspur and Fairfax, respectively, were on the most recent committee. Bill Long, who was introduced earlier, was on the first one representing the Novato Sand District. So in the way that Scott had kind of teed this up, he kind of looked at it as a CalPERS thing. But if you go back to 1999 with the passage of Senate Bill 400, there's a lot of blame that can be spread around to this, but certainly don't let the public narrative as it's morphed into currently define the problem, because people see it as a problem with the Great Recession. They see it as a problem with, in not being able to meet certain investment returns. Yeah, well, that's true. There was a reason for that. And the primary reason is that you came in with investment assumptions that were too high. But you have to look at who's asking for this, and yeah, when you're not to vilify employees, but when you have a situation where throughout the decade of the 90s, you have investment returns that are pretty steep. They were averaging about 16% a year, and in some years it was over 30%. So is it reasonable to say, well, we would like to have the benefit of those returns? The simple answer can be yes, but you really can't make it quite that simple. And one of the things when they came in asking for the return of 8.25% was that it never got any approval or analysis from the California Legislative Analyst Office, who is the group that does an independent review on legislation. That's how fast the legislation was actually pushed through. So while you have people who are asking and obviously have a vested interest in the ask, you also have the group that ultimately approved it. So, we can't necessarily place the blame on a single group or individual, but as a collective situation, it just was a bad thing. And now we're faced with what the LAO recognized immediately as being unsustainable. They came back in 2004 and published another report and said it was unsustainable, validating everything that they had originally predicted. And now we're basically seeing the results of it. So now I'm going to introduce John McCauley, council member from Mill Valley, and he will take you through our presentation, which goes a little bit more into the situation we're in, but more so what we can do that is within our control as cities or employers to try and work our way out of it, or at least become more financially in better financial shape so that we can ride through this wave. What we're really waiting for is we expect that it will take legislative action in order to really move the needle on this. And the best thing to do is to position yourself so that you're able to survive. It's about survival at this point. In the last one, someone asked me a question, and I kind of answered it using an analogy of being chased by a cheetah, two people. You're okay as long as you outrun your friend. So as agencies start to fail, hopefully that will be the driver that will make it so that the legislature will feel that there is something that needs to be done. Apparently right now it's not dire enough. So, John?
So I'm now here to convince you that it is a very dire situation. So Larry did a great job 8 years ago. He was very prescient, seeing that the pension situation was unsustainable. And at that time, he put together that first report. And the report was excellent in that it educated our Marin electeds to see what was possibly down on the horizon. But at that point, it was a little more theoretical. It was maybe something on the horizon. Well, it's no longer on the horizon. It has happened. If I had a shoe, I would drop it right now. The shoe has dropped. We'll get into the details. There are bills coming our way we cannot avoid, and that's what this topic is about. When updating the report to the current situation, I've always had a passion for another component of benefits, which is called other post-employment benefits, which is a fancy way of saying health care in retirement. I was in our New York national office when I was first admitted to the partnership, my partnership of my firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers. And by the way, it is the largest name in professional services. Okay. Back in those days, corporate America was not recognizing the cost of this promise that they were making, and suddenly General Motors realized that they were actually a healthcare company that made cars every now and then. That's what happened. So following that process, I had a deep interest in what our cities were doing, and when I was first elected, I really pushed on the OPEB's elements in my own town, and we'll discuss that component of cost also today. As you said, I worked for PwC. I served large clients, and that's important because I was in the boardrooms when corporate America was struggling with the impact of pension costs and the decisions that they were making. I saw the interplay between the importance of maintaining employees and also dealing with these costs. And it was a difficult time that occurred back in the 80s, so I've seen that. I also had the responsibility in my own practice office not just to serve clients, but I actually was in charge of my practice for about 10 years. So during a couple of internet booms and busts, I had the responsibility of hiring people, of terminating people when necessary, of making decisions about compensation. So for me, this is not academic. I ran a budget, I got a grade every month, and I got a report card every year. So this report is, by the way, is available on the MCCMC website. You can actually just use those 5 initials, MCCMC, and say pension. When I tell my wife I'm going to an MCCMC meeting, she always goes, "Oh, you're going to the MMMMMMM thing," because that's what it is. Okay. Now, one other thing. We wrote this paper carefully for the public. We didn't write it for academics. We didn't write it for graduate students in business school. We wrote it to make it readable, and hopefully we've had success on that. Take a look at that title. That was not an accident. This is a slow motion disaster. We'll get into this in just a second. My last introductory remark is when I rushed in here a little bit late, I was messing around, putting my tie on, and several friends said, "You don't need a tie." But let me just tell you one thing. In the old days, I wore a tie to work every day. Now, I pretty much only wear a tie at a wedding or at a funeral. Okay? So at the end of this presentation, you can decide whether it is the optimism of a wedding or perhaps the terminal situation of a funeral. I'll let you pick that. Okay, so let's get into the detail. My slides work. I'm very excited. So in Marin, most of you guys know this, but just to make sure you have a baseline, cities in Marin provide 2 post-employment benefits to employees. In other words, money we give you after you retire. Okay? One is called the pension benefit. Most of the cities in Marin participate in CalPERS, the state-run pension organization, and then San Rafael participates in a different group called MSERA, but the situation is consistent between both of them. The second matter, as I said, is a post-employment benefit, which is principally for medical coverage when you retire. And if you think about those costs, if you retire at 55, from 55 to 65, it's really expensive. And then once you turn 65, which I just turned very recently, you get into Medicare and the other costs do decline, but those costs are quite significant. So, let me give you a post-employment overview. The current total liabilities for all Marin cities exceed $401 million. Now that's a big number. I can't digest what that means, and I'll try to make it more real to you in a minute. But how did we get there? So, as Larry said, the stock market was great. Everybody was happy. Decision was made at the state level to share an increased benefit with all our employees and also make that retroactive back to employment date, which was a significant decision. And then after that, CalPERS, who basically bills all the cities and the counties and the state an amount of money so that there's enough money in the bank at a point of retirement, they had assumptions, and those assumptions weren't met. That's when Larry wrote his first paper, "Hey, these assumptions are not being met. They seem kind of optimistic. We're not sure we're going to get there." Okay? Well, finally, it's now time to deal with this situation. So I've got some numbers up there. CalPERS, Marin cities have a cumulative pension liability to CalPERS of $179 million, $120 million to MSERA for San Rafael. On the other post-employment benefit side, or OPEB side, $67 million on the CalPERS side and $33 million on the MSERA side. So you sit back and say, how the heck did this happen? Well, on the bottom, I give the rate of return of the markets over the last 10 years. The S&P 500 is up 14.7% annualized rate of return. Dow Jones 1503, Russell 1345. The fiction that the shortfall of the CalPERS is a result of market conditions is just not right. Okay, there were market declines in 2002 and also in 2018. That's the way market works. That's the way markets work. This is a long-term situation, and the real issue, in my opinion, is that it was benefit levels and funding levels. Those are the issues. How much is our promise, and how much are we paying on our promise? Okay, so what happened? CalPERS has finally decided to address the problem. The actuaries in Sacramento got together and they said, this is becoming untenable. We're heading towards what's called the death spiral. You can visualize what that looks like, okay? So they made some decisions. They changed some of their expectations for this very long liability. This is a really long liability. We're a boat, hopefully not the Titanic, in the middle of an ocean. We're making a short correction change so we can get from Europe to America. They've increased the mortality assumption. People live longer. We have to pay them more because we pay them until they're no longer with us, so they made a decision to increase the mortality assumption. They also decided to change to a more conservative investment mix, and that kind of makes sense. When your kids graduate college, you tell them on their 401k plan, put it all into equities, right, and it'll work out over your 40 years of work employment, you'll win. But as you get closer to retirement, or maybe after you're in retirement, you start making decisions like, I think I need some more bonds here, something a little more stable, not as aggressive as the market. I don't have time to make that up. And that's exactly what CalPERS has done, is they've changed their investment mix. As a result of that, they made a decision to change their discount rate. They've lowered their discount rate. Okay, what does that mean? What it means is, when you measure your total liability, what you're going to eventually have to pay, if your assumed rate of return on your assets is lower, you need more money. It's as simple as that. So lowering the discount rate means that the cities, counties, all the government entities are going to have to pay more money in to make sure the money is there when needed. And then lastly, the other major change that was made is this is a long-running assumption. There's a thing called the actuarially determined contribution. When measuring that, you can do this in a couple different ways. You can say, ooh, the market's up 30%. I don't need any money this year. Cool. Or you could say, ooh, the market's down 40%. I need a whole bunch of money this year. Well, that's not the way it works, right? They used a smoothing mechanism. It's all very mathematical, but a smoothing mechanism so that cities don't have to say, okay, we have to shut down our fire department for a year because we have to pay more money in, or wow, we can, redo all our roads. The idea is make it slow and steady over time, okay? Within all the math associated with that, and I won't do all the actuarial stuff because I don't want to see you guys completely fall asleep, there is assumptions about when you bring in good news and bad news. And the decision was made to bring that good news or bad news in faster. Because on the government side, their speed with which they brought in these events was much, 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 much slower than what happened in corporate America. It wasn't sustainable. And that's why for all those years when the obligations weren't being met and Larry was freaking out and writing the reports, the bills weren't getting higher, right? Because they were letting it slide in really, 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 really slow. So now it's like, hey, we got some bad news, let's bring it in. So all those things together result in us having to pay more, okay? So we're now paying the piper, and I'm going to now talk about what that upcoming bill is. But let me just say one more thing. Are these actions enough? We can have an 8-hour meeting here and have a conversation about whether 7% is the right discount rate and whether the amortization rate is right and whether the asset mix is right and all this stuff that people who are into the pension world want to talk about. And I have opinions on most of it. But you know what? The reality is with what they have done, the bills are coming. So while that's interesting, we have to deal with the fact that the bills are coming. Okay? Personally, I believe that CalPERS is still too optimistic. And I believe that as time goes on, they're going to have to make more changes which are going to cause us to have to pay more. But that conversation is a bit of a distraction because the reality is our city managers and our CFOs of our cities, they got to have enough money in the bank to pay the bill for the next 10 years. Okay, so that's what we're focused on. So I won't talk about all that other actuarial stuff that gets people who are into this all excited. So sorry, cost, we're not going to get into that. Okay. I just want to deal with what we've got. Okay. So the League of California Cities has conducted a study. It was the Bartell Associates, which is an actuarial organization, and they're very excited about all those numbers. They did an analysis. So remember I said $401 million? What the heck does that mean? Let's be a little more realistic about what it means, okay? In 2006 and 7, the average contribution for pension costs that were built into a city's budget was about 8.3%. That's risen to 11.2% now and is expected to be 15.8% by 2024-25. So what does that mean? That means that if everything else is relatively the same, the cost of pensions is going to double. Okay? Cities don't print money, so if we have to spend twice as much money on pensions, where's that money going to come from? Okay? And that's the gist of what our problem is. All the cities in Marin, now some of the cities in Marin have also engaged Bartel to do their own calculations. Mo Valley has done one. It's very much in line with these assumptions. I would say that cities, full-service cities that have fire and police, have higher percentages because they get better benefits. And this is a statewide number, but the relativity is roughly the same. And some of the cities in Marin are full service, some of them are not. Nevada's not, for instance. So it just varies who you are. But the message is the bills are going to get bigger for all of us, and we cannot avoid them. I talked about that allocation methodology. Okay, the market's been screaming, and we're still in this situation. Suppose the market continues to do super good for the next 8 or 9 years. Well, you know what? All the bad news comes in first. Then the good news comes in, okay? So we are not going to earn our way out of this problem in the short run. In the short run, the bills are coming, and the cities are going to have to pay for it. And this is not widely understood. Okay, so am I feeling more like a funeral or a wedding? Okay, so, so what's going to happen with rising costs? Well, all things being equal, you got to do something. So what could you do? All right, and these are the academic possibilities, and we'll talk about their practicality in a moment. So I'm not saying these are the solutions. These are just possible solutions. You can raise taxes and fees. Well, that's an easy one. You can lower benefits. Oh, I'm sure most of you are aware we have a thing called the California rule here, and we're precluded, at least right currently, from lowering benefits, at least on the pension side. We can lower our number of employees because there's plenty of them laying around. Okay, we can use our existing reserves. We didn't really need those reserves, or we can go out and borrow money, right? That's a possible solution. Or we can cut services that are provided to our residents. Let's get real here, okay? So, taxes and fees, voter fatigue, right? Everybody and their brothers send the taxes our way right now. You know, school districts, counties, and I would say, by the way, as much as I'm very conservative with regards to financial matters, I'm a big proponent. I'm really in favor of this new tax which we're going to vote on in connection with fire matters. So if you want to talk about it after the meeting, I'm glad to bend your ear. Okay, so can we lower benefits? Okay, we can't because of the California rule. Basically, the day you're employed, a city cannot offer you a lower benefit unless they exchange it for something for the remainder of your career and throughout your retirement. So you just get hired at 20, you get that deal till you're 90, okay, or later, hopefully 100, okay? So there's not much flexibility there. I'll get into some flexibility that does exist on a later slide. Decreasing the number of employees, okay? I'm talking about our 12 cities. These are small cities, small organizations, and it's nice to say, you know, it's fashionable to say, oh, people in the public sector are lazy. I work with my employees in my city. They're outstanding, and they work really hard. If you don't think so, this morning, if you happen to go out at 8 o'clock in the morning to get some coffee, did you see your DPW people out clearing the streets and getting all that stuff out of the way? I mean, we don't have employees laying around, and they are hardworking individuals. So that's not a good choice. Rainy day funds. Okay. What's it doing out there? It's raining. We need our rainy day funds, so that's not a solution. And you can't borrow your way out of this because this is going to take about 15 years to 20 years to work its way out. So, I mean, you know, you got interest costs. That doesn't make sense. So what's left, okay, you know, you can reduce services to our public. There go our roads, right? I mean, none of these are good answers. Okay, so what do we do? Okay. We have a suggestion. We have a few suggestions, 3 of them. We think that every city should develop a long-range plan, and I'll go into each of these individually in a minute. We believe that we should make the OPEB obligations more sustainable. I'll translate that into English on a later slide. And finally, we should be more transparent about our benefits, and I'll talk about that. So I'll talk about each of these 3 things in detail. Okay, so develop a long-range plan. Okay, as a CPA, private sector, spent my career working with really large clients. I know numbers, I had my own budget. When I first came to Mill Valley and started looking at our city budget, I was a little lost. It took me a little while to figure it out. It's a different model, you know. We don't have revenues and profits and the like, but we do have cash flow, and cash is king in cities, okay? So what should the cities do? Our suggestion is to make a 10-year budget, okay? Now, within that 10-year budget, you should assume a recession, right, in your base model. One of my council members said, why would you assume a recession in your base model? Wouldn't your base model be the normal model? A recession is normal, okay? We've had a recession. We've had 12 recessions since 1945. You have a recession every 6 years ago. So you got to build a recession into your assumptions. You don't have to pick the year, because we're just trying to get a look at the total, how the total feels. So if it's in year 3 or year 6, it doesn't matter, but you have to build in a recession. So what happens when a city has a recession? We each have different levels of, we have different ways of getting our money, okay? You have property taxes. The biggest ones are property taxes and sales taxes, okay? In California, as you know, Prop 13, the way Prop 13 works is we're limited to 2% increase each year in our property taxes. So in the event of a recession, you might see a slight decline in property taxes, but they're relatively stable. In fact, what generally happens is that when people sell their homes, as you know, the value is marked to market, and therefore there's an incremental benefit that the cities get. So the city's revenues from property taxes are generally growing at a nice rate during a normal situation. If there is a recession, that the number of new sales will decline, and as a result, your growth will decline, but you're still going to get roughly your base. Okay, so that's a relatively stable component of revenues, and it varies by city as to how much we rely on that source of revenues. So cities should model out what their expectations are there. The other side of the coin is sales tax. Sales tax in recession is obviously much more volatile, right? If most of your sales tax is from grocery stores, we're probably still going to eat during a recession, but we're probably going to eat less steak and have more hamburger, right? Or since it's Marin, we'll probably have less, I was going to make a joke about vegetables, but you know what I'm saying. Okay, so each city is going to be different in the way they rely on these things, and therefore each city should run their own analysis. And then once you find out the analysis, you need to do create a plan to deal with the shortfall. And I'll give you some ideas in just a moment. The point, though, as several of us have said, there are literally no easy solutions to this, but at least you should know what's headed your way. I talked to Senator Mark McGuire last week, and one of the points I made for the guy who's got such a large district, there are going to be people in his district who don't have the sophistication to know this is coming, and they're going to go to their bank account one day and go, uh-oh, we got a problem here. So to me, this idea of doing a 10-year plan is just critical. Every city needs to do one. Okay, so what are the things we can possibly do? Okay, if you can make smaller cuts now, put that money away, so then as the costs ramp up, you'll have that money available. Well, that's not easy, because where do you make those smaller cuts now? But it is a possibility. Now, in terms of where you put that money, I won't get into all the details of it. It's in the report. There are various ways you can put that money away. Some have more flexibility to get the revenues, get the monies back. Others are less flexible, but have a higher possibility of rate of return. So it's not a simple answer, and I'm not here to evangelize one particular answer. I think it varies by city, but we give all those details in the report. Okay, can you pursue greater taxes and fees? Well, as we said, some fees you can, because you can charge fees for costs. So if you've been behind on understanding what your cost structure is in your city, you could possibly raise fees fairly so that you are covering your costs for services that are provided. But in general, it's going to be awfully hard to raise taxes, realistically. And I'll get into the why of that in a minute, because later I'm going to compare a public sector employee's benefits to the remaining voters in the private sector, kind of make it a little real, and that will give us some sense of the difficulty of raising taxes. So, can we make less painful headcount cuts now? If you can cut one now, you might not have to cut 3 later, but that one's going to be hard to find, but that's a possibility, okay? So the point is, and my town's right in the middle of it. There's a subcommittee of myself and another, our mayor, Jim Wickham. We've just run the numbers. They're in the public. You can look at them. It was two or three meetings back. We have this big hole, and we have to figure out how we're going to fill that hole. And that's the hard work we're doing now. And I will attest, it is very hard. There's no simple, easy, oh, let's do that, right? But in connection with that, it's very critical that we share this bluntly and directly with all our constituents, right? Who are our constituents? Our constituents are all of us in this room, taxpayers. It certainly is our employees and any decision makers associated with how this thing moves forward. I can tell you that I did a similar presentation in the city of Mill Valley, and half the audience were men and women in blue, right? Our police and fire. And I was really not worried about it. In fact, I was thankful that they were there because I said, you guys, men and women, need to understand this, right? So when we go to the negotiating table, you have some understanding of what the realities are. Okay, so that's some news on pensions. Let's talk about OPEBs, other post-employment benefits. So unlike pensions, cities have more control over their other post-employment benefit. Now, I was pretty focused on just my city for a while, and then Larry has taught me. I got more involved in understanding what's going on in the county. And what I learned is the level of benefits varies pretty substantially between the cities. The promises that those elected before us have made are in some cases more generous, in some cases less generous. But the cities can negotiate on this topic, right? It's not easy, but you can negotiate. Mill Valley was successful in eliminating OPEB for all new employees. Now, that takes a while, but it helps, okay? So no new employees are getting OPEBs. Instead, they receive a RHSA, which is a retirement health savings account. So we put a little money in, they put a little money in. They have all the investment risk in terms of how they make it, but that's a nest egg, which helps towards covering those benefits in retirement. Some cities are using the Public Employees Medical and Hospital Care Act, and basically if you use that group to provide services to your current employees, you're obligated to provide a very minimum liability to those of your employees in retirement. But it's very affordable if you are a city. So if you're in that circumstance, you could perhaps lower to that number. Okay, the point I'm making here is that you can negotiate on these matters. It's not easy, but you can negotiate on them. And the other thing I'll say is many cities are not paying their OPEB's obligation on an actuarial basis over the life of the employee. So in other words, if you hire somebody when they're 20, when they retire, when they're 55 or 60, you'd think you'd put a little money away every year so that when they reach retirement, the net present value of their retirement obligation for health care has been put away. Many cities have not been following that technique. Historically, they've been doing what's called a pay-go, which means I'm just going to pay this year's bills for my employees, active employees, and this year's bills for my retired people. And as far as that future obligation, we'll kick that down the road. Other cities have used what's called a modified pay-go, which means, we have a little extra money, let's put a little bit of money away, okay? The third approach is to do a full actuarial evaluation and take your unfunded obligation, make some assumptions about rate of return, and say, how much money do I have to put away every year so that I'll have enough money for my retirees when they're available? After a little battling in my city council, we effectively did that, so we are paying our full actuarial obligation. I encourage all cities to do that because you put a little more, you put money away now, money makes money. In the long run, it will save you money. And it's also much fairer for your employees. The first thing that happens when a city goes bankrupt, and a number of cities have gone bankrupt, is they all lose their health care benefits. Bam. Next day, you don't have health care, right? So it's a really an obligation as an elected to, once you've made a promise, put enough money away to fill that promise. That's just the right ethic of it. Okay, the third idea we have is to be more transparent. So financial statements in the public sector are aggregated. As a result, there's a group called GASB, Government Accounting Standards Boards. They tell us how to put together our financial statements, and they are put together by function, by police, fire, library, rather than or without an addition of a summarization of your expenditures by costs. How much was payroll? How much was benefits? How much was purchases and roads and all that stuff, right? So although GASB does not require it, we believe, our subcommittee, is that it's fair, important to the taxpayer to understand the full cost of these obligations and be able to monitor them over time. Okay? So I pushed for this in Mill Valley. We did this a couple years ago. Just to give you a sense of what it looks like, you can add a separate footnote to the financial statements. There it is. And what it shows is that for the fiscal year 16-17, salaries and wages, right, money we put in people's payroll, was $14,104,984. Okay, so roughly $15 million. If you add up all the employee benefits costs, which are comprised of retiree medical premiums paid because we are funding our OPEB obligation, as I said, contributions to the OPEB trust, normal benefits like the money we have to pay CalPERS, medical and dental to our current employees, and other things like liability and disability insurance, workers' compensation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You add all that up, and with $14 million of payroll, we are spending an additional $8.2 million in benefits. So 58%. For every dollar of payroll, we have another 58 cents of benefits. That's important, so we all understand it collectively, okay? And our city council and others understand for every dollar of additional salary you give somebody, you have to figure out there's another 58 cents we're going to have to give them in benefits, right? So we encourage that level of information, and to make it sunshine, put it in the public. Because I couldn't find these numbers in my own city's financial statements. They were available, but you had to go into the budget stuff, and the budget files are like that thick. So it was like, come on, let's just make this clear. If I don't understand it in my own city, then since I'm a financial person, okay, that means we should work on this. So we're strongly advocating every city to do this, because then we can all as taxpayers understand our varying level of promise. Like I said, some cities are very ungenerous with regards to post-employment, like Nevada, for instance, has a very low obligation there. Other cities, mine was very generous, right? So that's why we kind of had to get after it. Okay, so earlier I talked about voter fatigue. Okay, now I want to put some numbers. I'm a numbers person, and this is where my wife always tells me slow down because I get excited about numbers and I talk too fast. But I want to put some comparative information out there so we can understand the difference between a regular voter and a public employee with regards to the benefits associated with pensions and the like. So among all, and every one of these numbers in here is footnoted in the report. You can see where they all came from, except a couple I added, and I'll tell you where I got those. So these are not John made up numbers. These are from credible sources. So among all workers in America, only 4% have access to a defined benefit pension plan where investment risk remains entirely with the employer, and that's all there is. So in other words, you have a pension plan, that pension plan is adequate for you in retirement, your employer is not offering you the equivalent of a 401k plan. Only 4% of America has that, okay? And by the way, all of our Marin citizens, our employees have that. Another 13% of all of America, this includes private and public sector, have access to both a defined benefit pension plan and a 401k type defined contribution plans. So some of the investment risk in that situation shifts from the defined benefit pension to the defined contribution 401k plan, like I'm sure we're all familiar with. We individually decide whether we're going to be in the market or in cash, right? Now, what's happened is that the benefit part has become a much smaller component of the overall assets available as people have shifted into defined contribution plans. And I watched this happen in corporate America, okay? And as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, during the 80s, most of my public clients had overfunded pension plans. They had plenty of money in them, okay? And they were feeling like, oh, that's cool. So they quit making contributions. They weren't required. And then, of course, the market went really south, and they started to understand the extreme volatility associated with pensions and determined they were not sustainable. So they had to make a decision, what are we going to do? So many corporate America, enterprises froze their pension plans and then started providing a 401k plan benefit instead. So for that 13% of people, that's typically what happened. Pension plans were frozen, they moved to a defined contribution type 401k plan. So some additional numbers, I looked this up, the Wall Street Journal, October 7th. In the Fortune 500, only 16 companies currently provide new employees with a pension benefit. In 1998, 238 of the 500 made that promise. Okay, so it's gone from 238 to only 16. And about 42% of all pension plans are frozen now. So basically, think of it this way. There's three levels. There's either a pension for everybody, new and existing, and it's a fully funded pension plan. Okay, that's one end of the spectrum. The second end of the middle zone might be, okay, we'll do that for everybody who is hired as of a certain date, but for new employees, we're not going to provide that benefit anymore, okay? And a third situation is the one I described where we freeze the pension plan for everybody, and we say, okay, frozen as of this year, everything you've earned in the past, that's what I think vested means, unlike the California rule, which thinks vested is the day you were hired. That's vested, you own that, that's yours, that's fair, and then they shift people to 401k plans. So the point is that the kind of benefit that exists in the public sector in Marin is unusual today. It's not what is commonly provided. So let's put some numbers around that, more numbers around that. So one thing, I'm very balanced about this, right? Public employees don't participate in Social Security, okay? And people in corporate America certainly do. So you have to compare the benefits within those two groups. So the average monthly Social Security payment in January 2019 was $1,461 per year. The maximum possible benefit based on annual salary of $132,900 in 2019 was $2,861 per month. I've given you a bunch of numbers. I'll put them in a table in a minute because I dig numbers, but other people go, well, that's a lot of numbers. So the point is, the way it works, by the way, in your pension, is that you as an individual contribute 6%, 6.2, I think it is, and then your employer contributes another 6.2. That stops at a certain dollar amount. If you make more than $132,000 a year, you're done. You only get this maximum benefit of $2,861, and the rest of it's, anything beyond that's your situation. So, many citizens have little retirement savings. Let's see. The median amount of retirement savings is about $95,000. So in addition to their benefits from Social Security, they've got another $100,000 in the bank. That's your typical voter. Okay, so that's the person who's being asked to provide more taxes to cover pensions. So let's talk about Marin public employees. So the average pay in 2018 was $87,638 a year. So take a miscellaneous employee with a 2.5% benefit factor, a typical factor, and that average, their final annual compensation, based on that, they would get about $7,303 a month. That compares to about $2,250, so they get about 3 times as much as you would get from Social Security. Now, let's talk about that average. Is that a fair number? Okay, it is the average of our employees, but average is tricky, right? Because you got a few highly paid people, you got some people who get paid less, so there's always an issue about mean versus median. That's something you have to focus on. But also, if it's the average employee's salary, the average employee is like, what, 40, right? So that means they have more earning years. Okay, so this number, I think, is a reasonably fair number when you balance those two things to paint a picture. Now, let's look at another number. A miscellaneous employee who's worked 40 years, 2.5% benefit factor, and $132,009 final average salary. Remember, that's the SSI max, right? How would that look? They would receive $11,000 per month, almost 4 times the SSI benefit of $2,861. So of Mill Valley's 153 employees, we have 37 who make $132,000 or more. If you make more than $132 and you're in the public sector, your benefit would be even higher. Now, it is capped. Okay, the classic employees are capped at $275,000. The so-called PEPRA employees, the ones that were a result of the law that was passed by Governor Brown, is capped at $150,000. Now, when people talk about pensions, they always love to get the most expensive person in the county and look at the egregious amount of compensation they get and their egregious, payroll benefit or pension benefit. I think that's not right. Okay. Because we're about to hire a new city manager, I'm going to go into the market and find out what a city manager's worth, right? So there's this whole thing about concentrate on the most expensive person in the county and get all aggravated about it. I think the better way to look at it, and that's why I did it here, is to look at that average compensation, right? A typical mid-level person in the public sector who's a hard-working individual who's getting around $87,000 a year, they'll get in retirement $7,303 a month. And compared to an employee in the private sector who's relying on their own 401k plan contributions and Social Security, they can look at a couple of $1,000s a month and whatever they manage to save. So the situations are different. Let's take a look at a slide that puts them together so you can see all those numbers at one spot. I'll give you a second to digest that. Okay. So to me, the long-term discussion, which by the way, it's academic because we're not allowed to change our pension promise, but our long-term situation to me is a question of what's the benefit level? Is that benefit level reasonable? And then who has the risk? Where's the investment risk, right? Is it with the individual or is it with the city? So that's the end of my prepared remarks. I would say that we're talking about three basic situations, right? Develop a long-range plan, understand the whole, get an understanding of how bad it is so you can start planning against it. Number two, something you can actually do is you can negotiate with regards to their other post-employment benefit liabilities, because these numbers are not small. That's something you can work on with your union groups. And then finally, be more transparent about costs. Let's all have honest conversation about these costs. And particularly with regards to that long-range plan, let everyone see it. Let people know what's headed their way. So that's the end of my prepared remarks, and now we get into Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So before we get started, John, should I pass the hat, or we just... No, never mind. All right, who would like to start?
Great presentation. Did the California Supreme Court uphold the California rule?
At this point, they've kind of danced around it. What happened was that there was a case that went before them maybe 6 months or so ago where it was about airtime. Airtime is when you purchase additional benefits and allow them to, like you purchase another 5 years. So it's extra service credit. When, I can't remember what agency, but when they said that they weren't going to give that anymore, the Supreme Court went and ruled that airtime was not considered a compensable benefit that was, to be accrued towards pensions. But Marin County currently has a case with their public employees that is in front of the Supreme Court, and several other public employers also had similar litigation brought against them for what was claimed to be a reduction of benefits. So the Supreme Court now is packaging all the cases together so that they can make a single ruling on this, roughly about 4 or 5 different cases, but the primary case is the Marin County Association of Public Employees versus the County of Marin.
Now, a couple of comments on how that ends up. There's a few ways to deal with this question. You can deal with it legislatively, or you can deal with it from the perspective of the law. If the law does change and allow cities to begin negotiating with their represented groups and lower that pension obligation, you got to go back and learn from what happened in San Jose, right? Because San Jose did make a change for their fire department or police department, and then like 6 months later there are no cops in town. So if this is going to happen, you can't. A small city can't take the lead on dealing with this matter. It's got to be some large organizations that say, okay, this is unsustainable, and make that move. That's my personal opinion with regards to freedom that comes from a change in law, or a change in the Supreme Court ruling. As far as law is concerned, the law has to be dealt with at our legislature. And based on everyone I've talked to, the appetite for that right now is basically zero. The view is that the what's it called? What's that thing? The brown the bill.
What, PEPRA?
PEPRA, yeah.
Public Employees Retirement Act.
Yeah, did Pepper solve the problem? That's what the view is. So the more pessimistic thing, I think, is analogous to Larry's cheetah comment. We're going to see some cities fail, and once cities start failing, the legislature will probably then have the appetite to deal with it. So that's my honest assessment. We will not get any relief for quite a while, so the only thing we can do is deal with the fact that bills are coming. My personal view.
Next question.
As a former San Francisco court reporter, you are the kind of person who speaks quick fast.
My wife would say I talk slow today. But.
I think what Mill Valley has done is commendable, if I understood you correctly. I don't know whether any other city in the county has done that. Now, have you put your employees on a defined contribution plan, basically?
No, I maybe sped this too fast. So everybody in Mill Valley is in the same pension plan with CalPERS as everybody else, and we're making our payments like everybody else. But Mill Valley had a separate promise, which was our healthcare promise, our healthcare in retirement, our OPEB promise. For that promise, we've eliminated it for new employees, and then for our existing employees, we're now putting the money away every year. We've already got $10 million put away against a total $30 million liability, so we're putting the money away to make sure it's there. So I think that's commendable, but we haven't removed the pension because we can't. It's not allowed. It's not legal.
Well, why, and this question is addressed to both of you, or either of you, why are we not, at the very least, offering a defined contribution plan to new employees? That would not be applicable to the California rule, would it?
In this particular case, the compensation for public employees is defined in the California government. It's in the California Government Code as it relates to compensation. I think it's Section 16 or something like that of the California State Constitution. So that part of it is already built in where they get a defined benefit plan. When Governor Brown made his first set of proposals in 2013, which ultimately became, the Public Employees Pension Retirement Act, HEPRA. One of the suggestions was to have a hybrid plan because public employees don't participate in Social Security, and then the rest of it would then be defined contribution, more like a 401k plan for the private sector, and I think it's a 457 plan for public employees. So that part, which was probably the bulk of that legislation, was not going to get support from the California legislature. So that was left out of PEPRA. So the substantive changes to PEPRA actually were never made.
Next question here.
Hi. How much have you been impacted by Prop 13 with your funding? Because there are a lot of elderly folks here who've had their homes for 50, 60 years, so they're not paying the same. They're paying on maybe $500,000 that they bought, and now it's worth $2 million. Who knows the way things are going up? How are you keeping track of the changes, and have you benefited from the houses being sold and the increase in property values to pay towards this?
So Prop 13 is working just like Howard Jarvis wanted it. So if you bought your house when you were 40 and you're now 70 or 80, your bills go up a very small amount each year, and you're not going to have to leave your house to pay your property taxes. So from the city's perspective, those revenues are consistent, but only incremented by small amounts, by a maximum of 2%. So in a low inflation environment, you're just treading water as far as those residents and voters are concerned. For the voters and residents who move, and then somebody else buys their house, the Silicon Valley crowd moves into my town, then they pay the current freight, and the mix between the people who've been here a long time and then the new people who pay the higher rates have historically caused the revenues from property taxes to increase, not giantly, not like the housing costs have gone up, but in a rate that is, maybe at inflation or a little bit higher than inflation. So my point earlier was that when you do a 10-year budget, if you assume a recession, you can't assume that little extra goodness happening during the recession years.
Next question. Actually, I have one while you're thinking. Oh, go ahead.
I'm not sure I'm right, but if only public employees can retire at age 55, and most of the rest of us have to retire at 65, is there some room to increase the retirement age and save some money that way?
Well, part of PEPRA for at least new employees, because they couldn't address the California rule. For new employees, what they did was they raised the minimum retirement age for the miscellaneous employees. That's non-public safety, so police, fire, in Southern California, lifeguards, EMTs, things like that. That's public safety. So all the rest of your staff are miscellaneous, and they had theirs raised to 62 from, well, depending on the plan, it could have been 50, it could have been 55. Most of the Marin cities are 55. Or I think all of them are. And then on the public safety side, about half the Marin cities were at 50, and then about half of them were at 55, and I believe that only went up to 57. What you end up with is kind of this odd balance. If it's not 57, it's still at 55, but you have to look at what a firefighter or police officer's body goes through over the course of 30 years, and you end up having to pay a lot more, say, in disability if you make them work longer. So, already if you look at a lot of, people who are in public safety, they've got some physical thing that forces them to retire a lot of times, and that could actually place a higher burden on the employer.
There's also another interesting interplay that exists for the cities that have a generous health care promise, because the longer you are employed, the more money you make, obviously, but that starts to cap out, and the longer you've been around, you pay it for a shorter period of time, and you get the benefit of a seasoned employee within the company. That's one reason the pensions were always called the golden handcuff, to keep people in employment. If you think the other side, when I was in the national office dealing with other post-employment benefits back in the 80s, we always called pensions the smart promise and post-employment health care the dumb promise, because post-employment health care is not affected by salary, right? It's just, whoever you are, the top person, the lowest person, we're still going to give you health care coverage. And while staying longer provides a benefit to the employee from the perspective of a higher pension, leaving earlier provides them a much more costly benefit from the perspective of health care. So they don't intersect very well. Health care encourages you to leave early, and pensions encourages you to leave late. And we have to deal with both of the promises. So it's an interesting interplay back and forth.
We've got a lot of special districts and JPAs and others who have similar problems. When you were looking at this problem for cities and towns, did you look at it, is there anything different about a special district or a JPA?
The first time we did this in 2011, we had invited all public agencies in Marin to participate, and we actually had Novato Sand District, MMWD, and I can't remember if there was a third one. So this time around, we kind of kept it in-house because of the speed we wanted to get through the thing. But fundamentally, everyone's got the same problem. You're under the same types of plans, and arguably your funding may actually be a little more difficult because it's primarily property tax and fees. So at least we have a little bit of a different revenue mix when you add in things like sales tax, which can vary depending on, the city you live in.
Oh, one other quick point I forgot to say earlier. So, and we'll say this in the January, as my wife would say, MMMMMM meeting. Any electeds that are here from special districts or from cities, Larry and I are glad to go on a roadshow and give a presentation like this to your city. If you'd like to invite us, we'd be glad to do that. Unless there's powder in Tahoe.
When PEPRA was being negotiated in the legislature early this decade, there was a proposal for, I think it was 10 points. Here's the 10-point plan we have to, in response to this popular pressure for reform. And I asked our then Assemblyman Michael Allen, how many of those 10 points do you think the legislature will pass? And he said 13 or 14 or 15. But I don't think that's exactly what happened. I'm not sure all the 10 points got passed, and I'm not sure if any extras were. Could you enlighten me on maybe a more accurate version? That was a prediction he made before the passage of the final bill.
Yeah, like I was saying earlier, in my opinion, they were clipping around the edges when they passed PEPRA. I think they passed about 6 or 7 of them, but the substantive changes did not. The ability to go to defined contribution plan, whether it be hybrid or all DC, did not happen. They did not do anything to fundamentally change the OPEB side. And the ability to change your benefit factors in the different tiers was not built into that either. So that's where you're going to get the most effective and substantive changes, and those did not occur. And at this point, from what we've been told through individual communications with people in the legislature, they feel that PEPRA was their job at reforming pensions, and they've moved on to what they believe are other things now.
So here, a hand over here. There we go.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation. I'm very fond of the word transparency, and I think that that's something that certainly needs to happen more often. One of the things that, even though, John, I noticed that you said that we shouldn't deal with just the top people who are getting these contracts and benefits, it's definitely something that people are very interested in, and some of these city managers and different heads of our organizations seem to be paid like rock stars. They have good, really fantastic contracts, they have cars, they have housing allowances, they have all sorts of things. And so I think it's very worthwhile to see what those contracts are and how those people are assessed, especially when they move into getting full-time benefits. Something that I thought you might add to your list of comparing one thing to the other is how much also each of the groups contribute. When you contribute to your 401k program and if somebody's matching it in a big company or something like this, you put $1 in and somebody else puts in something else. My understanding is that these are very different contributions, both by the employees in various large companies and certainly public employees as well. They're not contributing at the same level. So that was a great slide. I think that could be added to. Something, my last little comment is that when we're asked to pay for these extra taxes, parcel taxes, and so on and so forth, the transparency around that and how much of those are actually going to pay for that is going to make a big difference for voter fatigue. The bonds have always been very broad, which I can understand. The cities want to use them where they are. Parcel tax, the same thing. They're going to do roads, they're going to do this and that, but they end up getting paid into a general fund, which often pays for salaries. So I would encourage you to keep talking and keep talking to a lot of people, because I think there's a lot of interest there. Thank you.
I think both to your comment and Greg's, those things are in the report, but we have an appendix which has a lot of detailed write-ups for those who really want to get into the nuts and bolts of things. So the analysis on PEPRA is in the back, and there's also charts on the employee versus employer contributions on one of the charts also.
Back in the good old days, our property taxes were deductible against our federal income taxes. Has this had an impact in any way?
I forgot, that was on my slides, but I forgot to mention that. As soon as you guys do your tax return this year, you're going to find out $10,000, right? So that's it. You only get $10,000 deduction for state and local taxes. So I am not paying my second property tax bill in November like I usually do. I'm not paying my final California estimated tax payment in December like I usually did, because that would help with your deductibility. I'm going to wait until January now. But you are correct that the impact of SALT is a state and local tax deductibility is going to have people are going to wake up to that, I think, when they file their taxes this year, and it will certainly have an impact on the ability to get successful matters passed in terms of taxes. And Larry wrote this part. There's a great section that goes in great detail about the way taxes can be raised and through bonds and the like, and what the voting percentages are and all that. It's quite educational if you want to see that. That's also in the document. But the answer is yes, it's going to make things harder. And to Susan's comment, the problem with looking at an increase, say, a parcel tax, as she pointed out correctly, Susan Clough, if you look at your pension payment being 12% before and 24% now, dollars are dollars, so you could argue that 25% of any additional tax is associated with the pension cost because it's crowding out other benefits. That's the reality. So, I agree. That's the way it is.
So it appears that reducing or increasing taxes isn't very possible, right? And
it's up to you.
Well, it's hard to get that passed, and it also appears to me that there's probably not enough steam behind the ability of the cities to negotiate with their unions. And that the reason for that is because the voters don't understand this issue. And it's only when they finally do understand this issue that they may pressure the city council members enough that they will stand up to it. And I say city council members because, if I understand this correctly, the chief negotiators with unions are the city managers and the county managers, whatnot. And that's always struck me as flawed because they end up getting the same benefits that the unions get, so how hard can they negotiate? But the bottom line is, without some probably fairly inflammatory kind of campaign that gets people worked up about this, there won't be the political will to negotiate with the unions.
Is there a conflict between city managers and negotiating their own union contracts?
I think when you look at it fundamentally, the answer is yes, and it goes all the way up to CalPERS, because they're the ones who propose the legislation or any proposals for any increase in benefits. And when you look at the majority of their board being elected out of their own employees or the retirees, that's true of any pension system. So even the councils, to a large degree, as council members, we participate in the same pension system. I am a CalPERS employee. And I will be retiring next week, and I will get 40% of my $275 a month. So, I think if you wanted a yes or no answer, the answer is yes.
And I'd kind of just say kind of. I mean, it really depends on the type of city manager and city senior financial officer you have. I can just tell you in my town, they're pure as gold in terms of not thinking about themselves when you negotiate with them. Eric Erickson, our city accountant, is, I'm in the meetings. He's very reasonable on that, and it varies as to whether councils participate in pensions. In Mill Valley, nobody does. We all said no. The other observation I've got: you don't get to pick who you work with, And if I was going to look at each of the 12 cities, what I'd say, each city should have one CPA. Each city should have one lawyer. Each city should not have 4 or 5 lawyers. One would be enough. And I think one accountant would be enough. But that's not the way it works. So the purpose of this report and our willingness to go out and communicate with people is the range of knowledge is extremely varied that we found among our council members. And our mission has been to educate them so they understand what their decisions are. Even the idea of the increased salary has a benefit effect. Those kinds of things are something that we've been evangelical about. So,
Okay, probably have time for one or two more.
Speaking of voter fatigue, last night, Novato Unified School District agreed to put a 50% parcel tax increase on the ballot in March. Not much was said about school districts. Any special considerations as far as those?
we didn't do school districts, and it's a little more complicated because some of those revenues are carried at the state level and are allocated down to the cities. My wife was a school board president. But it's the same issue, right? What do you say, Larry?
I mean, they have exactly the same issues as the cities, except worse. You know, if you ask Joe Nation or David Crane, both down at Stanford, you know, with their studies, they'll tell you that financially, CalSTRS is in worse shape than CalPERS. Okay, I haven't studied CalSTRS yet, but what I do know is that because of the way, as John referred to, the way that the pensions are structured for CalSTRS employees, the state's responsible for, say, paying in this most recent round of you know, when they lower the discount rate, the employer has to pay more. Well, the state was going to cover that. So when you hear about a school district saying we're getting less from the state, it's because the state, although are paying what they claim are a record amount of dollars per pupil, they've taken that off the top, so by the time it gets down to the districts, it makes them feel like they're getting less. So, you know, that's the struggle that they're dealing with, and I think one of the things that was really unfortunate when we did our first study is that we invited the school district, we meet with this, MCCMC meets with the school districts every year, but they haven't had the will to really address this problem or study it. And, you know.
Yeah, the IJ just had an article a couple of weeks ago. There was another Stanford study, and it was called The Canary in the Gold Mine. And the joke of it is that if you can't afford salaries in Marin, where can you? And that paper studied a couple different cities. So it's worth looking at if you want to get some information. You just go to the IJ and Google it, or just say Canary in Gold Mine, and you can probably find it.
I don't have a question, but it's more of a comment to confirm with the other person up front regarding the Novato School District, second largest school district in Marin County. We had a presentation. I couldn't go to the school district meeting last night, but we had a presentation from the new superintendent of Novato Unified School District, and he pointed out that their strategy of why they're trying to raise the taxes, and the problem is that on last year's budget, they already are paying 8.7% for their out of the district's money, and it's going within less than 4 years, going to 17.3%. So they're already in the hole for this year, and they project a serious problem further down the track. You mentioned about the cities, Larry. You're right. The districts and schools are having a serious problem as well, and that's not being addressed very well. Thank you.
All right, last one. Here we go.
Not a question, but I think your idea of a long-term 10-year financial plan makes a lot of sense because it provides a way to communicate to the public and to the employees, the staff, the situation they're facing and the options then that plan will identify of cutting employees, raising taxes, get that dialogue going year after year with the community. It can only help.
Well, good. That means I was wearing a wedding suit and not a funeral suit. Thank you.
I think as a closing comment, the one question you didn't ask is, well, what can we do? Okay, and I think just the sheer notion of you being here and having an interest in this topic is one of the ways that, you know, you can talk about it when you're outside, you know, topic comes up, you know, people ask about it. You're obviously, you know, motivated to learn more about public process, how money is spent and all that. Just look at information that's given to you in the public narrative and use your critical thinking skills to ask the right questions, because what you're presented may not be untrue, but it's how how the information is framed. You know, I don't want to pick on the schools, but they always say, oh, we're 48th or 49th in spending per pupil. Well, that's an adjusted figure. You know, California is always kind of in there in the middle, you know, around, you know, in the low 20s. If you take the sheer number of dollars spent and number of students, that number puts us in the 20s. So I won't get into it. I'm just saying that the number that's always published and used for the public narrative is adjusted for affordability.
And with that, let's thank our speakers for an excellent presentation.